me. All right, so we'll wait for people to join. This is being recorded. Nice, Cyril.
Good morning.
Morning.
I know it may sound almost like a running gag because it's probably the third time that it's happening to me. But yesterday when I tried to do the quiz, I had the exact same problem as 2 weeks ago. It told me that the questions were not available. And I heard the same claim from one or two other students.
Yeah, that's strange.
About the celebrities.
Yeah. I mean, if I set the deadline, I mean, I had to put a deadline in. So I put it, for like 5 days later. I don't know if I have to check on that later.
Yeah, but the deadline was still this morning, so it wasn't a problem.
Yeah,
In
no,
terms
I
of
don't,
deadline.
no, I don't know. I mean, I have to look into it, in terms of the kind of computer issues that are coming up because I set that, for a week after the start of the class. So I have to go back and look at it and see if I can play around with it some more and see if it works. But okay, it's 8 o'clock here, and your code number is 288. So let me go back to the 288 and go back to Cyber Campus and go here. Stop screen share 288 and go to chat and put in 288. And there we go. 288 is your attendance number. So you can please put that in. And all right. So I'm here at my hotel room in Nashville, Tennessee, and the International Studies Association meeting is held at a big, expensive convention center here in the capital of country music, media, entertainment in the United States, in Nashville, Tennessee. And so the hotel is really expensive there. So being a poor college professor, I cannot afford to stay there. So I'm staying at a cheap place, cheap, relatively speaking, that's close to the convention center. And it's awfully interesting to be here because it's surrounded by country music performance bars where there's a band playing all the time outside that I can. So I'm teaching from the wash area of my room because it's the quietest part of my hotel room. So all right, so we are being recorded, and so let's. I did the smart attendance, and so let's go then and begin to talk about the class reading for this week. And I posted notes and a PowerPoint presentation, and so here I think are the notes. Oh no, this is the paragraph that's due tomorrow. To South Koreans, American civil liberties put civil rights plus civil rights show that America is the freest major power in the world. So that's pretty provocative. And again, I since I keep forgetting to reference this, here is a Supreme Court ruling that happened in 2015. Was it 2015 or 2014? Decided in 2015 that legalized gay marriage in the United States. And the reason I'm showing it is because the notes don't cover, well, the PowerPoint slides don't cover this case because the PowerPoint slides were produced back a while ago, and there's big money involved in these materials that we use to teach these classes. So to get the new slides and a new textbook, it costs like $200 to buy them. So we update them as we use them here. But this is, again, another case of a U.S. Supreme Court ruling, Obergefell versus Hodges, that was responsible for making gay marriage legal, or at least not unconstitutional, in the United States. And in a 5-4 ruling, like, for example, Brown versus Board of Education, not so close, back in the 1950s, that made segregation of races of Black and white children in schools illegal or unconstitutional. Or the 1967 case, Loving versus Virginia, that made barring interracial marriages illegal, unconstitutional. Again, this is probably one of the most important civil rights cases of the Supreme Court. More recently, the case that made gay marriage legal. At least you could not make it illegal in different states. And this is still controversial, like a lot of other Supreme Court decisions are controversial, like, for example, the Supreme Court decision to make abortion, making it legal, or at least cannot be called unconstitutional. That states must not make abortion illegal, period. They can restrict it, they can limit it, but they can't make it illegal in Roe versus Wade, another Supreme Court case. So I think you can see this. So maybe you can still see it if I go, just to show you, of course, the other cases that, of course, Wikipedia is useful for basic source information. This is Roe v. Wade from 1973. And the concern, and then it was reinforced in a 1992 decision by Planned Parenthood versus the governor of Pennsylvania at the time, man by the name of Casey. That's why it's called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, because the state government of Pennsylvania in the United States was attempting to restrict abortion, and the Supreme Court reaffirmed Roe versus Wade. The concern is that this Supreme Court is going to remove these restrictions, these legal limitations on restrictions to abortion in the upcoming case this year, in a Mississippi case, which I don't know if it's referenced here, just to show. Yeah, this is the one that's going to be decided this year. That will probably, most observers I read decide it's going to be decided in 2022. That will overturn probably Casey and allow states to restrict abortion to the point of basically making it unavailable to people that don't have resources, economic resources, to get it done elsewhere outside of Mississippi. And so this is Dobbs versus Jackson, Mississippi. That's the city in Mississippi, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. So again, you see the important role of the U.S. Supreme Court in intervening to turn these civil liberties into civil rights that must be upheld nationally, that overrides the state of Texas or the state of Pennsylvania or other states attempt to restrict other cases. And of course, there are other cases that militant conservatives advocate to be overturned. There's even discussion of returning other cases, which maybe I won't go into here, but they come up in the notes. So let's go to the notes, back to the notes. And so we have a chat here. Thank you. Okay. All right. So there you go. Everybody's online. All right. I have to check the chat because sometimes there's technical problems and people can only tell me by chatting. So, so let's go back then to the notes, and I think the notes are here, and so we go here, and you can see here are the notes. There you can see. So again, so this is civil rights, and again, noting that from the very founding of the English colonies in North America, the ones at least that survived, because there was a founding in 1588 in Virginia, what is today Virginia, that disappeared. But there was another attempt in 1619 in Virginia. And at that very same time, slaves were brought from Africa as field laborers. So slavery was present from the very beginning of the founding of the American colonies. And I'm not a historian. I don't really know how extensive slavery was in England at the time compared to what it became later, but there may have been enslaved Africans in England in 1619, but I've never encountered any references to them. But from the very founding of the American colonies, there was a decision made that slaves were going to be brought in as field laborers to make this project work, to make it profitable, in other words. And not to mention survive, but also to make it profitable. But so this issue of enslaving people, and again, the reason why this is important, because as I keep mentioning again and again in my classes, is that this is the most important conflict issue in American politics. If you want to understand how American democracy and American constitutional law and American politics has evolved, the most important, not the only one, but the most important conflict issue that drives and motivates political behavior in the United States historically is slavery and its legacy. The conflict between people that self-identify as whites and the conflict between people who self-identify as Black. And I say self-identify because that's a subjective definition, right? You are Black in the United States according to prevailing attitudinal assumptions. I'm not saying that everybody views this way, but the prevailing attitudinal and emotional, including emotional response, that anybody who has any evidence of any Black ancestry in their physical appearance is considered Black. It doesn't matter if you're very, very light skinned, but if somebody can tell that you look like you had a great grandparent who was Black, you're Black. And the significance of that is because of the stereotyping of enslaved people in this self-serving cognitive process that we call a motivated reasoning that I've referenced before, founded by people like Leon Festinger, a great social psychologist, and Fritz Heider, another one, that people tend to see the world, they make themselves see the world in a way that makes them or allows them to feel good about doing what they want to do for their own benefit. So if you're making a lot of money from slavery and enslaved people, you're going to want to justify enslaving them in a way that makes you feel good or allows you to feel good or allows you to accept emotionally that your slavery is not a bad thing, that slavery is in fact a good thing, and that people who are enslaved deserve to be enslaved. They deserve to be slaves. It's good for them. And because they're somehow inferior, they're not equal to me as a white person, and they are not equal, and they have to be enslaved to be civilized. They have to be, because they're viewed with contempt, they're viewed with disgust, and I am doing them a benefit by uplifting them, by taking them from Africa, buying them from slavers in Africa, taking them to America. I'm doing a good thing for those people. because those people are so backward and inferior, and that is the stereotype that is institutionalized through practice of countless generations of Americans. Well, not countless, I mean, 200, 300, 400 years, you can count those generations. And that continues to be institutionalized in American economics, American politics. And this is the essence of what is called critical race theory that is so much discussed today in politics, because it is a political issue, because they claim that college professors teach American students, according to the critics of critical race theory, teach American students that American state is inherently a racist state based upon white supremacy, and those white people today are benefited from it. And the implicit argument is that more should be done to help poor people, because poor people are disproportionately, not all, but disproportionately Black and non-white people, including Hispanics and Indian Americans. Asian Americans are a complicated issue, because Asian Americans tend to be higher achieving. They tend to come from powerful states like China and Japan and South Korea. These are powerful states, or Taiwan, which is not officially a state. And so Americans tend to associate them with power and opportunity historically, which mitigates the racist reaction that Americans have had towards particularly Chinese and Japanese immigrants in the United States earlier in the 20th and in the 19th centuries. But of course, you know, this is really important because African states are considered weak and poor and corrupt. And so there's less of this material collective incentive to view Africans as representing a power in the world, to be quite blunt about it. But of course, at the same time, people can think and they could understand that, you know, these Black people, they have these abilities, that they are human beings. And so there was always a tension from the founding of the United States, going back to the writing of the US Constitution, in which there was a ban placed upon the importation of slaves, but it was allowed to continue until the beginning of the 19th century, and you know, in horrible conditions in which the death rates of these people who were forced to, who were enslaved and brought to America across the Atlantic Ocean on slave ships was, of course, put on film with that film that came out. When was it? About 20 years ago. What is the name of that? I have to look it up later. By Steven Spielberg. But anyway, so and then with the industrialization, the beginning of industrialization in Great Britain and elsewhere, this parochial institution of slavery became institutionalized further because it was useful in making more money with the technological development of industrialization, including the development of what's called the cotton gin. And the cotton gin is a simple machine that made it easy to take the seeds out of the cotton. When you take the cotton off the cotton plant, it has seeds in it. And in the past, people had to take each cotton boll and physically try to remove these seeds, which takes a long time. But then someone developed, well, I can't remember who, you could find out, the cotton gin, and this allowed for the industrial expansion of plantation agriculture in cotton, which can only be grown in certain areas, like in the South. It doesn't grow north of in the northern part of the United States because it can't. So this provided further incentives for institutionalizing slavery as an economic interest on a early modern economic scale. So in this sense, you know, industrialization would threaten slavery, but at first industrialization encouraged the development of the institution of slavery when a commodity, what we call today commodity agriculture to support industries that emerging modern industries becomes a feature of the early modern economy. And so the cotton gin, let's see what, let's open this up here. What does Wikipedia have for the cotton gin? You can see here that the cotton gin is highlighted in Wikipedia. It developed by, I guess, by an American inventor, Eli Whitney, developed it and patented it at the end of the 18th century. And so this is after American independence. I didn't know it was, yeah, I think I do recall that it was that late. This is after American independence, but you can tell after American independence, the development of the cotton gin would make cotton plantations and enslaved labor, for at least for a while, tremendously profitable for those people who are already invested in it. And that would face further challenges as the economy continued to develop, and the incentives collectively for making labor something that you had to pay for by the time, rather than buying an entire human being. Yeah, I want labor, I'm going to buy an entire human being and force that person to work for me as my property. You know, from a modern economics perspective, you can see how that's, among other things, including horrible and unjust, terribly inefficient, increasingly economically inefficient. Rather, I as an employer or as a manufacturer who's building industrial plants, I want to pay people for their labor, just as much labor as I need. I'll hire them for a week, I'll hire them for a month, I'll hire them for a year, I'll hire them for an hour. But to commodify labor by time, rather than to say, if I want labor, I got to buy a human and keep that human and do something with that human and justify keeping that human and build an entire civilization and an entire worldview about slavery and how slavery is a good thing, particularly since I've invested my entire economic and my economic well-being and my identity as a person living in society. You know, keep in mind, most of those soldiers fighting for the South in the American Civil War to defend slavery in the South, most of them, the great majority of them, did not own any slaves. They were poor white men. They were not, I don't know how poor they were, but they were white men. The overwhelming majority of those soldiers did not own any slaves. And yet they were willing to fight and die to defend, quote unquote, their way of life. Right? So it's an interesting point about the role of slavery in creating an entire culture that people fight and die for and become very emotional about, obviously, because, you know, clearly these people felt very emotional about their right to own human beings as labor, because they're willing to fight a civil war, and a nasty civil war, a nasty war where we began to see the impact of the Industrial Revolution on warfare. All right, but let's go on here and back to the notes. So of course, nobody likes to be told that they got something that they don't deserve. So that's the part of the resistance or hostility to critical race theory, is partly because it motivates lots of white voters to vote for American politicians who promise to defend traditional American values against socialism. Socialism is bad, and the socialists want to use the power of the state to redistribute the profits from the people who earn their hard-earned profits and their hard-earned salaries and give it to poor people who are poor because they're, you know, and there's this implicit racism involved, right? That they're poor because it's their fault, that they're lazy. Okay, so again, just to continue here, enslaved people suffered a wide range of abuses, including beatings and sexual assault. I think only 4 out of every 100, on one source I read, only 4 out of every 100 Black people survived to the age of 60 during the time of slavery. So only 4% of Blacks born in slavery lived to be 60 years old, which I guess gives you an indication about their living conditions. Enslaved people, family separation, as individual slaves were sold to other slave owners. So slave owners would trade and sell their enslaved labor, and so families would be separated that way, undermining the commitment to families, because you couldn't be certain that your owner, your master, if you were an enslaved person, might not break up the family and sell people, slaves, their property to other people. And of course, people who were born to slaves, to women who were enslaved, were also considered to be slaves. Even if the father was a white man, a free white man, as many were, the one way to create property, to create wealth, was to allow, you know, Black women to become impregnated, no matter how, by their husbands or by being raped by other people, including white men. And if even though it was technically, it was illegal to rape your Black enslaved people, if you're a slave owner and you Black women are making babies, you're becoming more prosperous just by them making babies. So this is the reality of slavery. And again, slaves were a high luxury. They were a high value item. It was unusual for people to own slaves, because to own a slave was a big investment and was worth a lot of money, which most people did not have, right? And I think one report I read years ago would be the equivalent of the cost of, say, $150,000, but I read that 10 years ago. So enslaved people were enslaved in the South, where cotton was grown and slavery was legal, but they would go to the North, where slavery was increasingly illegal. It wasn't initially illegal, but it became illegal in the North, in the northern states. And then Congress responded by passing the Fugitive Slave Act in 1793 that required the return of any escaped slaves to their owners. And again, all of these statements have Wikipedia entries, which are nice introductory statements about these cases, these elements, these references that you can look at if you're interested. I want to do an extended project to get us thinking about civil rights in the US. And I might have to sit down to do this, because I have to do a lot of clicking and sharing of files, and it's probably best done if I'm sitting down. So a lot of this is this discussion of history of slavery, you might say, well, we covered a lot of that last week in covering civil liberties, but the important point to note is that the development of civil rights as a national obligation of the federal government to enforce, to overcome the arbitrary or unconstitutional or wrong actions of states or counties or towns. Remember, there's these thousands and thousands of governments in the United States, if you include the states and the counties and the local governments, that the federal government can stop or prevent or override the actions of those thousands of governments, including the state governments. That is what has involved the development of human rights, has been a big focus of human rights, has been a big source of controversy regarding human rights in the United States. So somebody's saying that they're having trouble hearing me. And let me go back to stop share. So I'm seeing that it's recording that I'm speaking. So I don't know what more I can do. I guess maybe if it's recording, if you want to go back and check it, you can. The recording, because I'll post the recording on the website. But hopefully, I don't know, if anybody else is having a problem hearing me, please let us know. It appears that it tells me that it is using the microphone, but oh yeah, well, okay. Maybe I'm trying to say too much. Maybe the computer and the internet can't handle all the data that I'm throwing at it. So maybe if I close some of these unnecessary files, maybe it will be possible to hear more clearly. So I can close this, and so is it becoming a little bit clear now?
For the moment, it's been a little bit better.
Yeah, I just closed a couple websites. I don't know if that makes a really big difference, but let me.
Maybe if you have access to another Wi-Fi connection, maybe you can try to switch.
Yeah, well, I don't. I mean, I'm in my hotel room, so right now. Maybe I can try to do something later, but we'll try to go forward here, and I'll just try to focus more on the, let me see, what did I just do? Did I just close the? Okay, so hopefully it's a little bit easier to I've closed all files that I can close here. So maybe I should talk less and have you do more, and to reduce our use of data streaming. And I just assumed, I think I told people in the previous class, I think the internet connection in the United States is just generally not as good as it is in South Korea, because when I was home with my family in January and February, I stayed at my brother's place, and he works from home, and so he really relies upon a good internet connection. And maybe I'll stop my video. Maybe if I stop my video, that will open up more space for the audio. Does that? I hope that makes a difference. I've stopped my video, so you can't see me. Maybe that reduces the use of data space, so you can get more audio. The things sound clear now?
It seems to be the case.
Okay, so I just have to keep that off. I'm gonna just keep off my video. So didn't really think about that until now, that can't use the video so much. But all right, so let me go to an exercise, and we go to let me open up a file here. So and let me just to continue here. Well, maybe just to continue or close these comments, that that we have to talk about the legacy of slavery in the United States because that's the main issue for American civil rights today. And that issue of civil rights and the experience of the struggle for civil rights for African Americans has been used or developed in the constitutional law, like for most explicitly in the development of the 14th Amendment that we highlighted briefly in the last class. That was one of the three constitutional amendments that were adopted as a result of the Civil War. And the 14th Amendment provided equality under the law as a guarantee, and that includes due process. And if a group of people is going to be separated and treated differently because they're different, there needs to be a good constitutional justification for that. So that was a product of the Civil War, which was a product of the fight against slavery, and it was used to try to ensure that newly freed Black men and women would have the right to would have a fair trial. We're supposed to be not abused by the local sheriffs and police units, particularly the sheriffs at the time, and that they had to have a fair trial with a jury and a jury trial. Everything that Americans consider, going back to the English foundings, critically important in terms of what we call human rights today. You have a right to a fair trial if you are accused of a crime, and that has to be an impartial jury, and all of the elements that go back to the founding of the legal system in Great Britain. And that 14th Amendment would be used explicitly in the Obergefell versus Hedges decision of 2015, 7 years ago, that violated the 14th Amendment due process clause. The 14th Amendment due process, the clause in the 14th Amendment that says that you cannot select out or treat a separate category of people differently from the rule of law from everybody else, unless there's a really, really important justification for it. And claiming that, for example, gay people can't get married, there's not a good enough justification to make that illegal. And that was the argument in Obergefell versus Hedges, that making gay marriage illegal is not justified, is wrong. And of course, there are bad things that have happened under the 14th Amendment, most notably, during the World War II, in the anti-Japanese hysteria that characterized the United States after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the entry of the Americans into the Second World War. There was a Supreme Court ruling, I think it was Kurosawa, in which the US Supreme Court ruled in the 1940s that making Japanese Americans move and be forced to live in internment camps was constitutional, was legal. So the argument was, of course, national security, that we're at war with the Japanese Americans are somehow untrustworthy, and we have to put them in concentration camps, basically, to make sure that they can't do damage against us. So let me see if I can show you that court case, because that's come up again most recently in treatment of Muslims in the United States. Let me see if I can find it here, because I can't remember the Japanese name. I think it was so Supreme Court, and see, Korematsu. Yes, there it is. Korematsu versus the United States. Just to make sure you can see that, that was the court case that the Supreme Court in that case ruled it was okay. It was acceptable to force Japanese Americans to sell their homes, sell their businesses, and be forced to live in internment camps because they were suspect as being potential spies and agents of the Japanese enemy during World War II. And this is from 1944. So they were not protected by the 14th Amendment, according to this unfortunate landmark decision by the United States Supreme Court. So, yeah, I think an important point to keep in mind is that, everything is political. What you eat, what you dream, what I believe, this is all politically significant. And civil rights, like human rights in general, are creations of politics. Human beings create these things. Human beings create notions of human rights and civil rights, and they make them, they create them, and they enforce them, and they can fail to enforce them. I mean, they're not granted, we can come up with justifications for them. We can talk about how God wants it, but unless people implement it and make it happen, it doesn't happen. And that means people demand these things and make these changes happen in society, like, for example, abolishing slavery. I mean, the abolitionist movement was obviously critically important, but then jumping ahead to the civil rights movement in the 1940s and 50s, because that's where we need to go right now, is that the after the American Civil War, okay, yeah, sure, the U.S. Slavery has been abolished as an institution, but then soon, well, relatively soon, by the late 1870s, there was so much resistance and hostility to the northern enforcement of the rights of Black people under the Constitution in the South, that it seems that there was some collective, not a collective decision, but a collective acquiescence to just giving up. That there was so much hostility and resistance to actually giving substantive significance and substantive enforcement of these human rights, these civil rights under the Constitution, that the U.S. federal government decided basically to just give up. Okay, you couldn't again have slavery, but what were adopted were so-called Jim Crow laws. So here we see Jim Crow is, of course, a big entry in Wikipedia, yeah. So make sure you can see this. And this is just a general term that refers to the characterization of Black people as clowns. So here you see Jim Crow. And Jim Crow, you can see this is a musical performance by white people making their face black with makeup and then mocking Black people as being silly, as being dumb, as being like childlike, the stereotype of the colonial stereotype that empire builders have, that the people that they control, whether externally or domestically, that they're like children, and they are children. And what is the stereotype of children? Children are lazy. Children don't want to work. The children like to play. The children are silly. Children are dumb, and they need to be civilized. They need to be raised properly, like adults need to raise children. So similarly, Black people are basically clowns. And this Jim Crow is the name of a character that a white man propagated as a performer, and this became the term that was used to refer to what are called Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws were legal segregation, the forced segregation of Black people away from white people. They were not formally often forbidden from voting, but it was made so impossible to vote, or so difficult to vote, that basically became impossible. even though Black people acquired the right to vote after being freed immediately after the Civil War, they by the end of the 20th century, the southern states, the states of Alabama, Montgomery, Florida, Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, not so much, well, I don't want to talk about Missouri, Louisiana, North and South Carolina, Virginia, that they had all passed laws that basically made it almost virtually impossible for Black people to actually exercise the right to vote. For example, requiring, some ridiculous, restrictions, like, for example, requiring Black people to guess the number of jelly beans in a jar. Right? And this was done at the county level. Remember, we talked about in the previous class, the counties of the states organize elections. So in each county, there would be this effort by white power groups in that county to keep Black people from voting by making it, and the state government of Alabama passing laws that, require that you can only vote, for example, if you're illiterate. And so you give these Black people an extremely difficult piece of English literature to read or to study and to explain. Of course, they couldn't, because nobody could, unless you were college educated, but they wouldn't give this requirement or make a white person do the same thing. So this is at a base level, reflecting this institutionalized worldview among white people, not only, but particularly in the American South, that Black people cannot be equal to white people. And coming up with self-serving ways of justifying that Black people, like a Jim Crow, that they're lesser humans. So we're going to let lesser humans have control over me. Lesser humans going to determine who's the governor, who's the government. You're going to let lesser humans vote and use their power, because there are a lot of them, to try to take away my money, my profits, by raising my taxes to give to them. These lesser, nobody's used those terms typically, although there were people who did. They would just openly say that Black people are inferior to white people. Sure, you could say that until the middle of the 20th century. If you say it today, you're considered to be a Nazi, a fascist, right? So white supremacy is not articulated by people claiming, I think white people are superior to Black people. They say that, America is not a racist society. And the people that oppose critical race theory argue that white people are not racist, inherently racist, and that America is not inherently racist, and that Black people are poor because they are, it's their fault. And there's this implicit racism, particularly by political entrepreneurs who exploit this resentment, particularly among people that white people that are economically struggling or economically unhappy about their condition, their status and economic conditions in society, and they look for a scapegoat. It's human nature to look for somebody to blame for the fact that, I work really hard and I don't make enough money. And what's the reason why I can't find a better job easily? It's because the government is blocking capitalism by taxing us too high, and particularly because they're taxing people too high to pay for these welfare benefits that go to lazy Black people and irresponsible Black people who are having babies before and not able to afford them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I grew up with that kind of commentary, that kind of worldview, that kind of environment, because I was born in 1962. So when the civil rights movement was reaching its peak, so I recall this unease in American society regarding people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others. But it's so much of American politics today in 2022 is a reaction against the policies that were adopted in the 1960s, particularly under the Lyndon Johnson administration, who came to power after Kennedy was assassinated, to pass United States federal government legislation to end Jim Crow segregation, keeping Black people separate and down, to end Jim Crow segregation, and to make it possible for Black people actually to exercise their legal right to vote. This legislation includes, what's here? Okay. So is it better now? Can you hear me now?
Right now, yes.
Okay.
But about 2 minutes ago, it was very, very hard to keep up with the information because it was, well, the word cuts every 2 seconds.
Yeah, I think, yeah, this internet connection is, okay, so I'll try to do something here by
Yeah,
our
because
host.
for about 10 minutes straight, it was almost impossible to understand anything.
Yeah. Okay, I'll see what I can do. Um, you know, there's a McDonald's close. I don't know. I don't know how people are going to react if I'm talking to computer for 3 hours in a McDonald's where they have Wi-Fi. I'll try to figure out something to do. Find a place where I have better Wi-Fi. Okay. Okay, then I'm going to talk less, and I'm going to focus more on the exercise here. And again, I mean, I will post the recording if you want to go back and watch the recording on the website, because it's being recorded on my laptop, so I can post that. And I'm assuming that it will be there won't be a problem with audio on the recording. But let's go do the exercise, since we need to do something to focus less on transmitting so much data through me talking. Maybe this will be a better way to illustrate some of these points. So, okay, so let's go here. And so let me open this up. And so this is, again, from that series of educational materials on teaching American students about the history of civil rights. And again, this is kind of controversial, even to this day, you know, even though this is highlighted as a high point in American development, in the spread of democracy, there are still many people that are resentful about these laws and these restrictions on the ability of business owners, for example, hotel owners. I mean, there was a time when hotel owners in the United States would, in many places, discriminate. You could not come and live and stay in a hotel if you were a Black person. You had to go to a hotel that only served Black people. So let me go back to the exercise here and show you share the screen again, not share, sorry, but to go back to the chat. And let me stop share and chat, and we go here. And okay, so I'm sending you this file, and have you gotten the file? So please open that file that I've sent you in the chat, and you should see this. So please open that file. And so again, this file is meant to be shared and used among American students who, of course, there's this underlying history of tension and that politicians have exploited. Certain politicians have exploited. Donald Trump, most recently, right? Donald Trump built his political movement primarily on this notion of conservative populist white resentment, not only against civil rights and government intervention to protect Black people, but all of these civil rights movements that emerged, particularly in the 1950s and particularly 1960s and 70s, including the women's rights movement and these movements that aim to build upon the drive for change that really began most significantly with the African-American civil rights movement. But then when the Vietnam War began in the mid-1960s for most Americans, when it began for them, and this resistance to and hostility to this war grew, it provided a lot of fuel, a lot of political drive, political motivation for activism by groups in society that were minority groups, not just racial groups, but women, gays, young people who were viewing the political rulers of the United States as basically representing an increasingly oppressive, even deadly order as manifested by its policies in Vietnam. And so, as I said, there was a US Supreme Court played a big role in aligning with these movements that were showing up in social justice movements in the form of student activism, youth activism, women's activism, and increasingly receptive responses by Americans in the public because of their, not only, but particularly because of their hostility to the Vietnam War. And of course, for a lot of men, they had a very personal, immediate interest or stake in opposing the Vietnam War because of the military draft, the requirement for men at the time until 1973, that certain men could be randomly chosen to be forced to join the US Army or Air Force or Navy, the US military, and they had to fight, join the military, and very likely be forced to go to Vietnam. And so there have always been these activists, but there became more receptivity among the mass public to their activism and their demands as a result of the catastrophe that was the Vietnam War, the disaster that was the Vietnam War that continued for years, which until the wars in Afghanistan was the longest war the Americans had ever fought. And it continued with escalation from 1965, with thousands of US soldiers being sent. They had been fighting before 1965, but on a mass level in 1965, and did not leave until 1973, and with 56,000 dead and many more wounded, and not to mention the Vietnamese casualties. But the controversy of that war and the extreme political difficulty that American leaders had in getting out of that war without losing their political jobs, without losing political elections, because that's the overwhelming drive for politicians. Not only, but you can make a safe assumption that their overwhelming drive is to get elected, and once they are elected to position, to be reelected, to keep their jobs. And the difficulty of leaving the Vietnam War was due to many Americans, included many Americans, feeling humiliated that we fought this war, we expended vast resources, we sent American boys to fight and die and kill, and we cannot lose. And this was a sentiment that many Americans shared. Not all, but your typical American, I would say, shared that resentment. That and the civil rights movements for women, for LGBTQ, these are all a response, partly a response to this hostility to the status quo, to the establishment in the United States that was engaged in what they claim was a grossly immoral war that was now being increasingly driven by American pride, or they argued over what were the sources of this war. Was it American pride? Was it capitalists seeking to make more money by arming the military? Was it control over the resources of Southeast Asia? These were all put forward as explanations for why America was fighting this war, when the original assumptions about the war appeared to be questionable. The original arguments made for entering the war, that America was fighting for freedom against communism. If America was fighting for freedom against godless communism, why wasn't America winning? Why were the godless, totalitarian, evil communists able to fight? Why did the godless, evil, totalitarian Vietnamese communists have so much support? Why? What is it about? Many of these activists were asking, why are we being evidently lied to? And why do so many Americans want to believe those lies? And what is it about America that produces those lies and produces the believers in those lies? And how should we change America to stop producing those lies and stop brainwashing people and stop people believing those lies and criticizing America and criticizing everything about America? It's consumption-focused culture. It's focus upon white beauty and white men power and traditional norms of behavior. All of that came under attack by mass new left social movements in the particularly in 1960s and into the 1970s. And many Americans reacted very hostilely, very negatively to these protests, challenging and attacking all the implicit assumptions about right and wrong, good and bad in American social, economic, and political behavior. And so much of American politics since then, up until now, at least up through Trump, has been a response to these new left social movements. So you got this file, and so it asks the students to think about what if, again, because everybody is taught, most people, young people are taught in America, that America is a country that loves freedom and America is all about democracy. What if there is a law that says you can only marry someone who is the same race as you? What if your state decided that only children of the same race can attend school together? What if the house you want to buy is in a neighborhood that only allows people of a certain race to move into that neighborhood? What if you go to vote and are given a really hard test to take? If you don't pass the test, the poll worker says you cannot vote because the claim is you're not educated enough, and voting is only for educated, responsible voters. If you can't read, if you can't think, you shouldn't be allowed to vote, because voting is a very serious, responsible obligation. So only those people who are seriously trained and educated and take these issues seriously enough should be allowed to vote. Sounds reasonable, huh? Is the camera working? I think so, right? My little green button's not on for some reason. I just want to make sure. Oh, sorry, my camera's off because I turned it off. Okay, sorry. As I mentioned, what if you are turned away from a hotel while you are on vacation because they don't serve people of your race? What if all of the city buses, trains, and subway cars had separate areas for different races? Keep in mind, African Americans today are 12% of the US population. At least that's 12% of the population. That means those 12% self-identify as Black. I mean, I'm sure there's a higher percentage of the population, people that are white in America that have Black ancestry, but they forgot about it or they don't want to know about it. You know, if you can't assimilate, you have lots of incentives to assimilate in American society. So the civil rights movement has a long history with many different leaders, participants, places, and events. Categorize the terms from the list in the middle in the correct box. You will learn about all of these items in the lesson. So let me see if I can turn on the camera. Well, I mean, I'm sharing screen, so you don't need to see me for me to share the screen, right? So if you can share, you can see my cursor moving, right? So you can see here are the big events of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. And so it asks you to place who are the leaders, who are the events, who are the laws, what are the laws in the courts, and what are the groups, the special interest groups, the social movement groups that were involved in this process. And So let me divide you into breakout rooms. And breakout rooms. And so we have 3. Let's make 4 groups. So that way each group gets 1 box and assign people automatically. And so these are the groups. So please join your groups. Please join room 1 and room 2 and room 3 and room 4. And so Micah and Jo Jean, please join room 1. Kim Pyong-koo and Lee Ju-young join room 2. Chung Do-jin and Cyril Amorsky join room 3. And Anis and Julie have joined room 4. Okay. And so what I would like you to do is to in this exercise, room 1, put the leaders here. Room 2, put the events from this list here. So room 1, look here through the list and put the leaders here. Room 3, look through the list and put the laws in the courts here. And room 4, look through this list and put the groups here. Okay. And so I will let you do that. And of course, it's quite simple, so we're not going to spend too much time on it because there are lots of different components to this little exercise. So, pick the top person in each group to speak. So it'd be Micah, Kim Pyong-koo, Chung Do-jin, and Anis will speak for each room. And so help each other. So you have 1 minute to do this because it's pretty easy, right? So you can go to room, go to work. Okay, so let's now go to room 1. And room 1, please, let me share the screen again. And room 1, who are the leaders that you selected from this list to put here?
I believe room 1 was me and who was it? And Ujin. So we, as leaders, we chose Martin Luther King Jr. As well as Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and Medgar Evers.
Yeah. Malcolm X was killed. The people convicted, the 3 black men who were convicted of his murder, were just pardoned or excused or found not guilty, like just a few months ago. They're at least the ones that were still alive in their 80s. Martin Luther King, of course, was assassinated in 1968. Rosa Parks, she never died, but she lived. She eventually moved to Detroit and died there. And she wasn't wealthy or famous for, well, at least in terms of commercial wealth, in terms of money. But somebody is trying to buy her home before it was demolished that she lived in. She was an activist. I mean, her sitting down on the bus to challenge the law in Montgomery, Alabama, where Hyundai Corporation, of course, is located today. The big South Korean auto manufacturer has a big plant in Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks led the bus boycott against the Montgomery, Alabama bus company, bus service, because the Montgomery, Alabama laws required that a black person had to give up their seat on the bus to a white person if there was no other seat available on the open on the bus. And so she refused to give up her seat. I think this was in 1954 or 53. I have to go back and check. And it was all planned. I mean, their protest was all planned. She belonged to this organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She was a regional leader of the NAACP, So, and she was educated. I mean, this was all a planned operation. And of course, there was much support for it. They knew or expected there would be a positive reaction as well as a hostile response to it. So it wasn't some spontaneous thing that Rosa Parks did on her own. There was lots of hard, long-term work done by many people whose names we do not know that made this event trigger a national push forward for ending Jim Crow segregation. And even to the point, for example, choosing her because her skin color, she was Black, but she was very light skin Black. So, this association of dark skin color with greater inferiority, that wasn't good because they needed to have somebody who would be appealing to a white television audience, because also at this time we have television. Television is becoming part of American society. And so if you're leading any social movement, including from today, LGBTQ rights or any social movement, you have to think about building public support. That means appealing to public opinion. That means appealing to people who are watching you. And so you have to try to be appealing to them. You have to look like you're not threatening to them. You have to look appealing to them. So Rosa Parks was chosen because she was articulate and educated. She had, in part because she was an activist, in part because her physical appearance was more charming on television. That's all part of social activism that you should learn today. Or anybody should learn that social movements require strategy and they require appealing to public opinion. That's why so much of the civil rights movement was so-called nonviolent. Even as they were being attacked and beaten up, these social justice demonstrators to abolish segregation and Jim Crow would be attacked by the police, and with their barking dogs being put on them as well. They engaged in nonviolent resistance while they were also dressed nicely in nice clothes and uniforms, because they wanted to make the police look like the violent people, the bad people, while these protesters are peaceful, educated people who want their rights and represent what is best about America. And singing songs, we shall overcome, we shall overcome. It's a very famous civil rights marching protest song. They sing this as they're being beat up by the police with their dogs and their clubs. Okay, and room 2, what events from this list do you put in under the category of events? Room 2.
Events, the March on Washington and March from Selma to Montgomery, and Montgomery Bus Boy Scout, Little Rock 9, and Greensboro lunch sitting.
Okay, yeah, these 9 students trying to go, I think it's the 9 students Black students trying to go to school in university in Little Rock, Arkansas, and being attacked and hounded by the white, the hatred of the people that, Black people must stay separate because Black people are, it's basically what Seymour Martin Lipset described in his book, American Exceptionalism, as the evidence of a caste society, right? So like in India, where we get the word caste from, this intense hostility of many higher caste Hindus, not all, but to government intervention by the state in India to help the Dalits and the untouchables, who tend to be much darker colored compared to the higher caste that tend to be more lightly colored. particularly at the top, the Brahmins, right? They tend to be very light skinned. The intense, it's just accepted as intuitively, intrinsically true that Black and white people must not mix. You know, it's something that's just seen as so emotionally true that, of course, during the Civil War, white people would fight and die to protect the institution of slavery. And to the present, you know, these so much hostility to this notion that Black people should be allowed to mix with white people, and you know, go so far as, for example, you know, a Black boy dating a white girl, your daughter, your white daughter, and then maybe getting married and making babies, which terrifies white people, many white people. Laws and courts. Okay, room 3. What goes in laws and courts? Room 3.
Yes, just a second because the text is very small. And Zoom, okay. So Loving versus Virginia, then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, then the Brown v. Board of Education, the 24th Amendment, and finally the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yeah, so and these this 24th Amendment was an effort to institutionalize in the Constitution the principles, not necessarily specific laws, but the principles in the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Act adopted when Lyndon Johnson was president, the same president that would make the disastrous decision to send thousands of US soldiers to fight in Vietnam. He's not given enough credit for these acts, but that the 24th Amendment forbid charging money for people to vote. So there used to be what were called poll taxes, that if you're going to vote, you had to pay a tax if you're going to vote. And the argument would be, of course, that, you know, it costs money to run an election. So if you want to participate in the election, you should pay some money, you know, as a tax to vote, because, you know, we have to have resources to run the election. Sounds at first sounds logical, doesn't it? But it was used basically to keep, again, an implicit, informal way to prevent poor people who are disproportionately Black from voting, because Black people were segregated. They were not allowed to have resources when they were slaves. Of course, they weren't paid, and so they were then segregated in bad schools with no resources, so their education was low. They were not allowed. They weren't getting hired to make a lot of money as workers in factories. They were basically became de facto serfs after slavery in the South, because okay, they were freed as slaves. They were no longer slaves, but they were given nothing. They weren't allowed to be educated under slavery, so they were illiterate. They had nothing. They had no money, nothing. So what most of them ended up doing is staying where they were and basically being forced to work as farmers on land that the landowner, the plantation owner, gave to them, let them farm in return for sharing a portion of their harvest with the plantation owner, with the landowner. And of course, these sharecroppers, they were called because they shared their crop with the landowner, would provide loans to these people to buy their seeds and buy their tools and whatever and as well as the land, and they could never pay it back, and so they would be hopelessly in debt. So they became basically not slaves but de facto serfs. And then since they were in debt, they had to pay the debt. And if they couldn't pay the debt, then the sheriff would be involved, the local police would be involved. So the 24th Amendment forbid requiring that you had to pay money to vote, because these people, it was an effort to put in the Constitution the rejection of Jim Crow. And so why did Lyndon Johnson administration adopt these laws? There's a lot of reasons, but one, of course, was the Cold War, because the Soviet Union is saying the Soviet communist model is the best model because we use the power of the state to overcome racism and discrimination. We don't allow it, we stop it. And you look what those Americans are doing to their Black people. Look, world, look, Koreans, look, Europeans, look what those Americans do to their Black people. The way they abuse them and repress them and even kill them in lynchings and spontaneous murders of Black people because some rumor circulated that some Black man was harassing a white woman. Even if it was true or not, a crowd of white men would come together and would hang the man from a tree in a lynching. So terror was part of this process of enforcement of segregation. And so this was part of the response of the Johnson administration to the Cold War, to make the American model have greater soft power appeal to the rest of the world in the competition with communism and the Soviet Union. Okay, group 4 in groups, what do you put here? Group 4 in groups?
Yes, so we have the NAACP, the core, and the SNCC.
Yeah, Southern Conference Leadership Conference, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Sorry. So again, one of the few ways that Black people were able, acceptably among white people, particularly in the South, to get a college education was to go to seminary to become preachers, to become moksadul, to become a moksa, a minister, because that was considered acceptable for Black people to be trained to become Christian ministers. So many of these activists have training as ministers, including the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a minister. He was, and his training as a minister obviously was important. One factor for his ability to give really good speeches, inspiring speeches. Some of the most notable rhetoric and speeches in American history came from him. And of course, if you're a preacher, if you're a moksa, you have experience, lots of experience, obviously, talking to groups of people in inspirational ways. And so you saw that ministers were disproportionately representing these leadership of these activist groups and these social movements demanding social justice. And again, this isn't just a history lesson. This is supposed to be lessons that you and I learn in terms of how we bring about social change through social justice movements, whatever you think requires social justice, and for peaceful change. Because if it's not peaceful, you get civil wars, like the United States, and now wars in other places, including in Ukraine. Medgar Evers was one of these. Also, he was assassinated as a leader of the NAACP. I think I can't remember what state it was. So keep in mind, this is how we're trying to introduce, particularly white students, including white students, to these notions and discussions that make a lot of white people uncomfortable. Okay, so then we go on here and to the second file to share. And no, that's not the right one. Sorry, we got to find the right one here. Okay, 3 and 4. Okay, open. Okay, so you're getting this file too. And it must be a big file because it's taking a while to load. And let me open it up while it's loading here. And let me screen share. So we go to screen share. Close the other one. Go here. Let me close the screen here. Oh, not that one. It's the right one. Okay, so go to screen share. And I think you have this file now, right? So isn't that discrimination? And there you see this context, these Black boys, these Black men. Again, they were. I think they were Black students, so they're educated students. sitting down at a whites only lunch counter. So stores in the United States used to have places where you could get a meal, a lunch counter where you could buy lunch while you're in the store, and they were segregated between white and black people, and you can see them engaging in civil disobedience. The term is civil disobedience by breaking up the law, because typically these were laws. There were laws in place that required separations. Here you can see you can make this even bigger, how black people and white people had different fountains for drinking water. You can see colored, white is the sign. Here we see a sign in front of a restaurant or a hotel. We serve whites only. It's totally acceptable, expected, of course, that black and white people should not intermix basically in any way, except maybe in certain areas or professions. But there you can see the water fountain. So, of course, the claim was this was justified by Plessy versus Ferguson, another Supreme Court case in, I think, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, that the Supreme Court at that time approved segregation, said segregation was legal. But the segregation of the races in separate train compartments, the issue at the time was about trains. Could you have a train compartment for black people and a separate train compartment for white people? And of course, this was challenged by a man named Ferguson, who challenged Plessy Company, the manufacturer of the trains that produced these trains. And of course, the claim was, well, they're separate. They're separate facilities for black people and separate facilities or trains for white people, but they're equal in quality. They're equal in comfort, and they never were. Whenever you try to separate races and claim, well, they're separate but equal conditions. There's a school for black kids and there's a school for white kids, but of course they're equal in their quality, and they never are equal in their quality. They aren't equal in their quality. And so you can see, here a water fountain for white people and a water fountain for colored. You can't really read it because of the pixels, but it says colored. Does that look equal to you? This looks like a refrigerated water cooler where the water is actually made cold, right? So you can drink it cold. That's not refrigerated. This is for black people. That's what you get, black people. So discrimination happens when one group is treated differently from another. Segregation happens when one group is kept separate from another group. Both of these happen when there is prejudice or intolerance. You often hear these words when people talk about the way African Americans have been treated in our country. Again, We Shall Overcome, the song. The Jim Crow laws that discriminated against African Americans might still exist today if it wasn't for the hard work of people in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. There had always been resistance to the discrimination that blacks faced, but during that time, people joined together, organized, and protested more than ever before. New laws were passed, other laws were declared unconstitutional, and things started to change in people's everyday lives. And so here's some discussion of the people that were involved. We already talked about that. Changes starts with people forcing people to pay attention. And so in these acts of nonviolent methods of civil disobedience, it's got to be nonviolent, because once it becomes violent, then the outside observers, the people watching these events, are going to react negatively because they don't pay close attention. They only know what they see on television, and they're being told by their leaders that people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers are communists, are troublemakers, are agitators, are dangerous. So if the police hit me, if I'm a protester and I hit the policeman back, people watching on television me hit the policeman back are probably going to blame me. They're going to blame me because they're going to assume that I did something to provoke the policeman. The assumption is that the people in power and the laws that are there and the people that enforce the laws, that they are given the benefit of the doubt, that they are what exists is good. what exists is right. If you're demanding change, you have to make a strong argument among people that are already predisposed, the mass public that is already predisposed to believe that people who want radical change, they're a problem. There's something wrong. So it has to be nonviolent, because once it becomes violent, you probably lose. So you have marches, involve large groups of protesters taking to the streets with signs, banners, songs, and chants. And you saw that again, the protest against Park Geun-hye to get her removed from office as president of South Korea, for example, the colorful signs and banners and creative ways by which to try to entertain people, appeal to people, the people that are watching on television, the people that are now watching on social media, to capture the attention of television cameras and cameras in general. Sit-ins were a way to integrate, bring the races together in business or public areas. So there you see a sit-in here. African Americans would sit at whites only areas and wait to be served. Boycotts called for the consumers to avoid a product or service that discriminated against African Americans. So when the Montgomery bus boycott occurred, the Black people agreed not to take the bus anymore and not pay the money to take the bus because they're not taking the bus. They would find their own ways to get to work. And this was very difficult for them because they had to find other ways of getting to work and shopping if they're not going to take the bus system in Montgomery. But the bus system really relied upon the income from those bus riders, those African-American bus riders, to make the bus service feasible. But without the money, it became unfeasible. So this financially unfeasible. So this caused the great turmoil by boycotting the Montgomery bus service. And cases challenged unfair laws. And so, yeah, the Supreme Court would step in the 1950s and 1960s in these Brown versus Board of Education, Loving versus Virginia, and later Obergefell versus Hedges in 2015. But there was a time when the Supreme Court did rule in favor of protecting unjust policies, including Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, and Korematsu versus United States in 1944. And the concern is now with the Trump appointees on the US Supreme Court, the judges that Donald Trump as president nominated were confirmed by the Republicans in the United States Supreme Court. Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh now give the conservatives six justices are conservatives nominated by conservative presidents, whether it be George W. Bush or Donald Trump, and 3 liberals, and that the US Supreme Court might well overturn Roe versus Wade this year. And there's been much commentary in the media about how the Supreme Court, except for that brief period, the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s, has been a conservative institution. And it could go back to being a conservative institution. So changes in the White House played an important role. I mean, there you see President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson was vice president under President Kennedy. One of the reasons why these Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were passed was because he was assassinated by a lone gunman, not by some conspiracy, just some troubled man who killed him. And the outpouring of grief and concern for the American stability, when already the civil rights movement is becoming more and more active. And I already mentioned that the civil rights movement was often nonviolent, but these marches and protests were also happening in American cities. And Black people would get in fights, the protesters would get in fights with the police. Something would happen, like when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, there were uprisings and riots among city areas where Black people were concentrated in the so-called ghettos, and they would burn and burn down and attack businesses in their rage, and the American army would be called in. And so America was a violent place, particularly during the Civil War, much more violent in political activism than it is today, despite what happened on January 6th. I mean, America was a much more politically violent place during the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 1970s. So part of this were reactions to the uprisings and protests, nonviolent and spontaneous riots. After these laws were proposed by Kennedy administration proposed these laws. The laws were not adopted until he was killed, and then he became president. And he pushed them through the Congress, and then he would not run for re-election in 1968 because of he took the blame for the disaster that was unfolding in Vietnam, and Richard Nixon would become president from 1969 until he resigned in 1974. Again, more first Black justice put on the U.S. Supreme Court. So there was just the first Black woman was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, is going to be appointed here in 2 or 3 weeks. Black woman, he was the first Black person to be on the U.S. Supreme Court. He was an activist for the NAACP. He represented the Brown family, Thurgood Marshall, in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. He became the first African-American justice of the Supreme Court in 1967. And then after he resigned and died, he was replaced by Clarence Thomas, who was a very conservative African-American justice. He's one of the most conservative right-wing. He's evidently a Trumper. As news reports have just come out, he and his wife, who's white, were strong Trump supporters, and his wife, Ginny Thomas, played a role as an activist organizing the January 6th effort to stop Joe Biden from being named president. This is all coming out now. Bailey versus Patterson, you can't segregate train stations, bus stations. Loving versus Virginia in 67. Again, we already talked about that. And there were people who opposed. Again, people who were opposing just grew up in this environment, and to challenge it seemed to be outrageous to so many white people, particularly in the American South. And I think that's a point to keep in mind, because now, of course, what's the big controversy? One of the big controversies today about LGBTQ rights. And for so many people here in Korea, or here in the United States, the notion that you can choose your gender, that you can be called, you can choose whether or not to be called he or she, even if you're born biologically male. Like, what is this? That we can allow children to undergo medical treatment to stop them from developing their biological gender, their biological sexual development through drugs. We're going to give drugs to children with the willingness of their parents to stop their children from developing, going through puberty, because they don't feel that they don't emotionally feel or identify with the biology that they were born with. What? It's just incredible for them. Like, and there were people who felt that way about desegregation. Black and white people be allowed to get together and date and marry. I got to remember the camera's not on, so you're not seeing me, my face. Okay, so then we go to the next file. And so that's opening. That's being sent to you. And so this is what you received. And let me get it set up here. And so you're going to share screen, go here. Okay, so this is the screen that you have. And what can we do here in terms of time? Maybe we can skip this page because we only have 20 minutes left in class. Let's divide you into 3 groups. Group 1, do this exercise. Group 2, do this exercise. And group 3, do this exercise. So that means I got to divide you into 3 groups. And into 3 groups randomly assigned. And the person at the top of the group will speak for the group. So please join these 3 groups. So Cyril, Kim Pyong-koo, and Lee Ju-young join room 1. Chung Do-jin and Jo Woo-jin join room 2. And Juliet and Micah join room 3. So please join those groups. And the first person each group will speak. And so room 1, do the top exercise. Room 2, do the middle exercise. And room 3, please do the bottom exercise. And let's go back to the share screen. Okay, so there's the, let's make sure you can see that. Yeah, so room 1, please do this exercise. Room 2, do this exercise. Room 3, do this exercise. And you know, these are easy, but so we won't spend too much time on them. And maybe we can just go to closing the rooms, 60 seconds. And 20 seconds. Okay, so let's go back to the share screen. Okay, so room 1. Here you see activists, so match the word with its definition. So which of these definitions goes with activist?
The C one.
C, people who protest to call attention to a cause like civil rights. And yeah, keep that in mind. That's an important point to note because like I said, I come from this background, right? I was born in a white working class, but with an immigrant father. And so I was a little bit different, but you know, people tend to assume that what exists, including social relations and who's in power, that's all, they tend to are predisposed to believe that that is right. So if somebody's going to protest against the status quo, they're already dealing with a predisposition among non-engaged close watchers, non-engaged, non-close watchers, observers, that they're troublemakers. So if you're going to demand change, you've got to think about how you can make people think and how to make them not hate you. Because there will be other people telling them, other leaders telling those non-engaged, non-closely watching observers that those activists are bad, that they're troublemakers, they're un-American, they're communists, they're socialists, they're radical feminists, they're anti-whites, they are whatever. Okay, so and what was the definition for 2? Segregation.
Keeping things where people separate.
Okay. And then the important point is, even if people are, the claim was always made that separate but equal, separate but equal, separate but equal, but that never happened. They were never equal. You saw with the water coolers, the water fountains, you saw with you would see it everywhere. Schools, homes, neighborhoods, okay? Nonviolent, how do you define nonviolent?
Peaceful.
Yay! And again, that's partly because you're trying to get public support. You're trying to get public support. So you do not want to appear violent, because these non-engaged people who see this violence will tend to give the benefit of the doubt to the police. You're a bad person. You deserve being beat on the head by that policeman with his baton. You must have done something wrong. Right? A discrimination.
When one group is treated differently than another group.
Okay. Yeah, if you're going to discriminate against LGBTQ people and say that they can't be married, you better have a good reason. And if it's not good enough, you can't do it. And again, during national security times, the war on terror, maybe special treatment towards Muslim migrants or Muslim travelers coming to America, maybe that's, or Muslims in general, maybe that should be, because we're at war. We're at war with terrorism. So, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Integration.
Bringing separate groups together, F.
Yes, and it's I mean, it's just difficult. I mean, I try to imagine myself. I mean, you know, if I just know from my own experience. I mean, I won't go into details, but like when we heard stories about somebody dating a black boy in our family, I was like, what? I guess the closest would be like in Eastern Europe, like if you heard that your sister or daughter was dating a gypsy, a Roma, a Tsigani in Slavic language. So Cyril and Micah can relate to Slavic language. How would you respond if you learned that your daughter or sister was dating a Tsigan? Because Roma are stereotyped the way African Americans are stereotyped. These are patterns you see everywhere. It's not just with African Americans. It's with Roma. It's with Koreans in Japan are stereotyped, and the childlike Jim Crow type stereotype. I mean, it's fascinating, this human predisposition to engage in stereotyping. It's something in our collective DNA. And prejudice.
Intolerance of a person or a group based on their race.
Yes, yes. Like all Tigani are crooks and thieves. I mean, at least 5% of the population in Bulgaria are Roma. You're not supposed to call them gypsies. That's not politically correct anymore. You're supposed to call them Roma and Romani. What's the French term for Tsigan? I don't know. Gitan, right? Gitan is the French term for a gypsy, isn't it? Anyway, so room 2. Take a look at the diary entries of these young civil rights activists and decide which type of protest they participated in. Check the action that each story describes. So room 2, what did you put down for 7?
Boycott.
Yes. Yes, so this describes the bus boycott. What did you put down for number 8?
Is sitting.
Yes, sit in. What did you put down for this one? This says number 7 too, but it should be 9. My feet hurt. What did you put down here?
I think March.
Yay! And 10?
Is a voter registration drive.
Okay, voter registration drive. Good. And of course, that's a big topic in discussion in the US today. As a response to the Donald Trump phenomenon, the claim, you can't come out and say, we're trying to make it more difficult for people to vote because we don't want Black people to vote. Nobody admits that. Very few people admit that in the United States, almost nobody. But to say that making it more difficult to vote for people that are poor because they don't have the resources, it sounds like to many people on the left that this is an implicit form of racism, that when you hear white supporters of Donald Trump say that Barack Obama and his supporters are socialists, that again, that poor people want to use the power of the state to take away the wealth and property of non-poor people. And the suspicion is that this is what Black activists and non-white activists want. And their justification is because they are poor, because white people have systematically built a society around exploiting and marginalizing and segregating Black people. And that this has become institutionalized in the form of prejudice that people are not willing to admit that they have in their own brains, because in a globalizing world, you're not supposed to admit you're racist. If you're racist, you're considered a primitive. And nobody wants to be considered a primitive, even if they are supporting policies that make it more difficult for Black people to do what white people take for granted. Okay, room 3. What goes? It says the civil. Yeah. So which of these words go in these blanks here? What goes here for 11? Room 3.
I'm sorry, sir, but we don't hear you like very well. Actually, we almost don't hear you at all.
Can you hear me now? Huh. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, it's better.
Okay, can you tell me what you would put here from these words?
The first one was the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee.
Yes. So
Yeah.
students played a leading
Then-
role in this effort.
Yeah.
Again, they were the more idealistic, more hopeful groups. What about 12, Congress on?
On racial equality.
Yeah, okay. And keep in mind there was more support for these policies among American public because America had changed from the time when the Civil War was fought. I mean, but still, only I think I might have mentioned in class, or I'll repeat if I did, maybe I didn't, but only by 1970. Only in 1970 did half, at least 50% of American adults have a high school diploma. Only in 1970, when I was 8 years old, did half of Americans have a high school diploma. So the point I'm making that education, public education emerges in the 19th century and expands through America, and it makes a difference along with America becoming more prosperous, America becoming more secure, America becoming more wealthy, and also with the rise of mass media like radio and then television that created conditions that made social movements a little more feasible in terms of generating effect on people. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay,
Yeah.
So what goes here? Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
And,
What goes here? Oh, I gave it away, sorry.
now we can't anymore.
And this one, National Association for the,
Okay, so the Yeah,
What
the
goes
next
here?
one, you mean?
What goes here?
Oh. Okay, so the next one was Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and then we have a National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
Uh-huh.
And then a Council of Federated Organizations.
Okay. Yeah, that's an important point. Social movements can be defined as institutionalized networks of groups that organize for sustained, contentious challenge to the political system. So it requires different groups that are organized among themselves. The groups form the NAACP, the National, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, social movements, but we have right-wing social movements as well, like the Tea Party movement is a right-wing social movement. And typically it's easier to organize people for for social movements in having an impact if you can appeal to their American identity or their Korean identity or their Ukrainian identity. And so nationalism, if that's how you define nationalism, which is the advancement of the well-being of my primary identity as a Ukrainian or an American or a Russian or a Chinese or Korean, that if you're able to get more likely to get more support from people if you can convince them that what you want is good for America or good for Korea or good for France or good for Switzerland or good for Poland. But typically right-wing people, right-wing movements have an advantage because they can say what's good for Poland or what's good for Americans is keeping non-Americans away. Adopting policies to oppose globalization, because globalization includes diversification. It includes more tolerance and diversity in law for different groups that do not fit the stereotypical image of what is essentially American, who is the ideal typical American, like a white cowboy. And so, but some people who study social movements, they highlight the challenge of nationalism, because nationalism is an effective way by which to try to mobilize people, and it's a tool that that political leaders often have to use if they want to get public support, more public support. They have to make a convincing, rhetorical, ethical argument how what they want is good not just for them, it's good for America, or it's good for France. And when you start talking in those terms, you make nationalist debates more feasible, because someone will say, it's not good for America to have lots of people coming from Mexico and Haiti and other countries into America with no money, who can't speak English, who are poor. That's not, and so, but it's a difficult paradox. It's a difficult issue. Okay, I'll tell you what, we'll see how this, I'll try to see what I can do by Tuesday to find another place with a better internet connection. I don't think I can really move out of my hotel room, but I'll see what I can do. And if necessary, as I mentioned in my email, we can make things up on week 8 during midterm week to compensate for problems. But I'll upload these recordings to Cyber Campus, and if somebody wants to check them to see if the recording, the audio is better on them, I would be curious to know. I mean, I can check myself, but I really didn't expect this to be the problem that it is. I guess I just took Korea for granted, and that being at a hotel where, lots of people in the business world are traveling and staying at these places, that the internet connection would be better than it is. But I guess, well, anyway, okay, well, I'll give you an update later. Any questions? Okay, if not, I'm going to sign off, okay? Bye.